One old Kiki, one unforgettable wedding, and one secret that changed everything. Everyone laughed when the groom arrived in a rusty old Kiki. The bride's family was humiliated, the guests mocked him, and no one believed the marriage would last. But before the day was over, a shocking truth would leave the entire town speechless. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into the story. The morning sun poured golden light over the quiet town of Asaba, painting the streets with warmth as people hurried about their daily lives. Inside one of the largest mansions in the neighborhood, however, peace was nowhere to be found. "What do you mean you have already chosen your husband?" Chief Benson Johnson's booming voice echoed through the luxurious living room. Crystal chandeliers trembled slightly from the force of his anger. Grace Johnson stood quietly in front of her father, her hands folded together. At 28 years old, she was known throughout the town for her beauty, kindness, and gentle spirit. She worked as a primary school teacher, a career she loved because it allowed her to shape young minds. Unlike many women from wealthy families, Grace never cared about expensive clothes or flashy jewelry. She believed a person's heart mattered far more than the size of their bank account. "I have chosen him, Father," she answered softly, though her voice carried confidence. "His name is David." Chief Benson stared at her as if she had just announced the end of the world. "That mechanic?" he shouted. "The man who fixes people's vehicles in a tiny roadside workshop?" Grace nodded. "Yes." Her mother's teacup slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor. "No," Mrs. Johnson whispered, shaking her head. "Please tell me this is a joke." "It isn't." Her older sister, Vivian, burst into laughter. "Oh, Grace," she said between giggles, "you must be practicing for a comedy show." Grace remained silent. Vivian walked closer, folding her arms. "Tell us the truth. Is he at least secretly rich? Did he inherit land somewhere? Maybe he owns houses we don't know about." Grace smiled gently. "He works hard every day. That's enough for me." Vivian rolled her eyes dramatically. "You've completely lost your mind." Chief Benson paced across the room, trying to control his anger. "For 28 years, I have raised you with dignity. I sent you to the best schools. I introduced you to governors, business owners, and influential families. Wealthy men have lined up to marry you, yet you rejected every single one of them." He stopped directly in front of her. "And now you want to marry a mechanic?" Grace looked into her father's eyes. "I want to marry a good man." "A good man?" Chief Benson scoffed. "Can goodness buy a house? Can kindness pay hospital bills? Can love send your future children to expensive schools?" Grace answered calmly. "Money can make life comfortable, Father, but it cannot make someone faithful, honest, or loving." Her father laughed bitterly. "Those are the words of someone who has never struggled." Grace wanted to remind him that some of the richest couples they knew lived miserable lives, but she remained respectful. Her mother finally found her voice. "My daughter, listen to us. Marriage is not just about love. It is about security." "I know, Mother." "Then why are you doing this?" Grace smiled sadly. "Because David gives me something money never could." "And what is that?" Vivian asked sarcastically. "Peace." The room fell silent. Chief Benson shook his head. "You barely know this man. I've known him for 2 years. And where exactly did you meet this wonderful mechanic?" Grace's eyes softened as memories filled her mind. "It was raining heavily after school one afternoon. My car broke down on the expressway. Every mechanic I called said they were too busy. David happened to be passing by. He stopped, fixed the car, and refused to collect any money." Vivian laughed. "That was probably because he wanted a rich girlfriend." Grace ignored the remark. "Later, I discovered he regularly repaired vehicles for widows without charging them. Sometimes he bought food for elderly people in his neighborhood. He never told anyone. I found out by accident." Chief Benson waved his hand dismissively. "Poor people always pretend to be generous." Grace frowned slightly. "He isn't pretending." "Oh, really?" He works honestly. He respects people. He keeps his promises. Those things matter to me. Her father sighed deeply. You have no idea how the world works. At that moment, the family butler entered. Sir, he announced politely. Mr. Michael Harrison is here. Chief Benson's face brightened immediately. Excellent. Send him in. A few moments later, Michael Harrison walked confidently into the room, wearing an expensive tailored suit and a luxury wristwatch worth millions of naira. He smiled warmly. Good afternoon, everyone. Chief Benson welcomed him with a hug. My future son-in-law. Grace looked away. Michael noticed her expression but ignored it. I brought flowers for Grace, he said, handing her a bouquet of red roses. She accepted them politely. Thank you. Michael smiled. I've been speaking with your father. I think it's time we fixed our wedding date. Grace placed the flowers gently on a nearby table. I'm sorry, Michael. He frowned. For what? I can't marry you. His smile disappeared. What do you mean? I've chosen someone else. Michael chuckled. I know you're trying to make me jealous. I'm not. Chief Benson interrupted. She's confused. Grace shook her head. I'm not confused. Michael looked directly at her. Who is he? David. The mechanic? She nodded. For several seconds, Michael simply stared at her. Then he laughed louder than anyone else. This has to be the funniest thing I've heard all year. It's true. He walked closer. What does he have that I don't? Grace answered without hesitation. A humble heart. Michael's jaw tightened. I own hotels. She remained silent. I have houses in Abuja, Lagos, and London. Silence. I can buy you anything you want. I don't want everything, Grace replied gently. I only want the right person. Michael clenched his fists. So you're choosing poverty. I'm choosing love. Chief Benson slammed his walking stick against the floor. Enough. Everyone fell quiet. As long as I am alive, he declared, there will never be a wedding between my daughter and that mechanic. Grace swallowed hard. I was hoping you would bless us. You have my answer. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I love you, Father. If you love me, he replied. Forget David. Grace took a slow, steady breath. I can't. Chief Benson pointed toward the staircase. Go to your room. She obeyed without another word. As she climbed the stairs, she could hear Vivian mocking her and Michael promising Chief Benson that he would make Grace change her mind. Inside her bedroom, Grace closed the door and leaned against it. For the first time that day, tears rolled down her cheeks. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from David. Good afternoon, my sunshine. I hope your meeting with your family went well. Remember, no matter what happens, never lose your smile. Better days are ahead. I'm praying for you. Grace wiped away her tears and smiled. He had no idea what had just happened, yet somehow he knew she needed encouragement. She typed a reply. Thank you. I needed those words today. A few seconds later, her phone rang. She answered. Hello. David's calm voice came through. You've been crying. She laughed softly. How did you know? I know your voice. She sat on the edge of her bed. They don't want us to get married. I expected that. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. They called you poor. David chuckled. I've been called worse. They laughed at you. People usually laugh at things they don't understand. Grace closed her eyes. Are you angry? No. Not even a little? No. Why? David looked out from his small roadside workshop, watching children play nearby with old bicycle tires. A warm smile spread across his face. Because one day, he said gently, they'll know the truth. Grace frowned. What truth? David smiled to himself but did not answer. Instead, he simply said, Trust me. She smiled despite everything. I always will. Little did Grace know, the humble man everyone mocked was hiding a secret so extraordinary that it would soon shake the entire town. And before their wedding day arrived, every person who looked down on David would discover that appearances could be the greatest deception of all. The day everyone had been talking about had finally arrived. From the early hours of the morning, the Johnson family mansion buzzed with activity. Decorators rushed from one corner of the compound to another, arranging fresh white and gold flowers. Caterers prepared hundreds of meals, while musicians tuned their instruments in anticipation of the grand celebration. Chief Benson Johnson had spared no expense. "If my daughter insists on marrying a poor man," he had told the event planner weeks earlier, "at least the wedding itself must look worthy of our family name." Rows of sparkling white chairs stretched across the beautifully decorated reception ground. Elegant crystal centerpieces shimmered under the bright morning sun, while a massive stage overlooked the venue. Luxury cars lined both sides of the street outside the mansion. Gleaming Mercedes-Benzes, Range Rovers, Lexus SUVs, and sleek sports cars belonging to wealthy guests. People admired the decorations as they arrived. "This must have cost a fortune. It looks like the wedding of a governor's daughter." The Johnson family never disappoints. Inside the bridal suite, Grace sat quietly as makeup artists put the finishing touches on her face. She looked breathtaking in her flowing white wedding gown, her natural beauty enhanced by simple, elegant makeup. A delicate veil rested behind her neatly styled curls. Despite her radiant appearance, her heart was restless. One of her bridesmaids noticed. "Are you nervous?" Grace smiled faintly. "A little. Don't worry. Everything will be perfect." Grace wanted to believe those words. She reached for her phone and found a message from David. "Today, I become the happiest man in the world. I'll see you soon." She smiled. His message calmed her heart. Meanwhile, in another part of town, David stood inside a small rented apartment, adjusting the sleeves of his neatly pressed navy blue suit. He looked strikingly handsome. His best friend, Samuel, stared at him with amusement. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" David smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." Samuel shook his head. "You own more companies than anyone in this state." David laughed. "So I've been told. You could arrive at the wedding in one of your Rolls Royces." "I could. You have a convoy of luxury SUVs waiting." "I know. You even have a helicopter on standby." David nodded. "I know." Samuel sighed deeply. And instead, David walked toward the window. Parked outside was an old yellow Nigerian Kiki. Its paint had faded over the years. One headlight looked newer than the other, and the engine made a loud rattling sound whenever it started. Samuel pointed toward it. "That?" David grinned. "Yes." Samuel burst into laughter. "I still can't believe you're actually doing this." David slipped his wristwatch into his pocket instead of wearing it. "It isn't about proving I'm rich." "Then what's the point?" David's smile softened. "I've spent years building businesses." Samuel listened quietly. "I've watched people respect me because of my money." David sighed. "But today," he looked toward the old Kiki, "I want people to show me who they really are." Samuel folded his arms. "And Grace?" David smiled warmly. "She already has." Outside, the elderly Kiki driver stood patiently waiting. David approached him. "Baba Musa." The old man smiled. "My son, thank you for helping me today. You've helped my family for years. Driving you to your wedding is the least I can do." David handed him a small envelope. Baba Musa tried to refuse. "You've already paid me. This isn't payment." "What is it?" "A gift." The old man accepted it without opening it. Neither of them knew the envelope contained enough money to buy him a brand new house. Moments later, the Kiki engine coughed loudly before finally starting. David climbed inside. As they drove toward the church, pedestrians turned to look. Some smiled, some laughed. Others simply wondered why such a well-dressed groom would ride in an old Kiki on his wedding day. David remained calm throughout the journey. Back at the church, guests had begun filling every seat. Inside, whispers floated through the air. "Where is the groom? He's already late. I heard he's just an ordinary mechanic." Poor Grace. Chief Benson checked his expensive wristwatch for what felt like the 100th time. His face grew darker with every passing minute. "This boy is embarrassing us already," he muttered. Vivian stood beside him. "I warned Grace." Michael Harrison, dressed in an expensive designer suit, watched everything with a smug smile. He leaned toward Chief Benson. "It isn't too late." Chief Benson looked at him. "What do you mean?" "If the groom doesn't show up, I'll marry Grace today." Chief Benson didn't answer. For a brief moment, he actually considered the idea. The pastor stepped outside the church entrance and looked down the road. Still no sign of the groom. Guests began murmuring louder. Maybe he ran away. I would too. He probably realized he couldn't afford this wedding. Laughter erupted among several guests. Inside the bridal room, Grace heard the whispers. One bridesmaid closed the curtains. "They're talking nonsense." Grace took a deep breath. "David will come." "You sound very sure." "I am." Outside, a young boy suddenly pointed toward the end of the street. "Look!" Everyone turned. An old yellow Kiki slowly rattled toward the church, making its familiar noisy engine sound. The closer it came, the louder the whispers became. "No! It can't be. Surely not." The Kiki stopped directly in front of the church entrance. For a few seconds, complete silence. Then the driver stepped down and opened the side. David calmly climbed out. His navy blue suit was perfectly tailored. His polished shoes gleamed in the sunlight. He carried himself with confidence and quiet dignity. Yet all anyone could see was the battered old Kiki behind him. A woman covered her mouth before laughing. Another guest couldn't hold back. Soon, the laughter spread through the crowd like wildfire. "Ha ha ha! Did the groom really come in that thing? I've never seen anything so embarrassing. Poor Grace." Several people pulled out their phones to record videos. "This will go viral. I have to post this." Vivian laughed so hard that tears filled her eyes. "I can't believe she's actually marrying him." Chief Benson felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He closed his eyes for a moment. "This is the greatest disgrace of my life." Michael smiled proudly. "I warned you." Some guests even walked closer to inspect the old Kiki as though it were part of the entertainment. One elderly man shook his head. "I've attended weddings for over 40 years. He sighed. "I've never seen anything like this." David thanked Baba Musa, shook his hand warmly, and adjusted his suit jacket. Not once did he look embarrassed. Not once did he lower his head. Instead, he walked confidently toward the church entrance. People continued laughing. Some deliberately moved aside as if they didn't want to be seen standing near him. Others whispered loud enough for him to hear. "He can't even afford a decent car. What kind of future will Grace have? This marriage won't last." David heard every word, yet his expression never changed. As he reached the church doors, Grace finally stepped outside. The laughter slowly faded. Their eyes met. For a moment, the crowd disappeared. Grace looked at the old Kiki. Then she looked back at David. A warm smile spread across her face. Without caring about the hundreds of watching eyes, she lifted the front of her wedding gown, walked down the steps, and embraced him tightly. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. David smiled. "I promised." She glanced briefly at the old Kiki. "It suits you." He laughed softly. "I was hoping you'd say that." Grace slipped her hand into his. "I don't care what anyone says." David squeezed her hand gently. "I know." Together, they turned toward the church doors. Behind them, the laughter slowly gave way to confused silence. For reasons no one could explain, the poor mechanic walking proudly beside his bride seemed completely untouched by their mockery. None of them realized that before the day was over, the same people laughing at the old Kiki would stand speechless before the man they had so carelessly judged. As David and Grace walked hand in hand into the church, every eye followed them. The laughter outside had faded, but the whispers had only grown louder. "Look at her. Such a beautiful woman. What a waste. I still can't believe she chose him." Several women shook their heads with pity as Grace passed by. One elderly woman sighed deeply. "If she were my daughter, I would stop this wedding immediately." Another replied, Love has truly made her blind. Grace heard every word, but she refused to react. She kept her head high, her fingers tightly intertwined with David's. David could feel the tension around them. He leaned closer and whispered, "Are you okay?" Grace looked at him and smiled. "I've never been better." Her answer warmed David's heart. They slowly walked down the aisle while the pianist played a soft wedding melody. Instead of admiring the bride, many guests stared at David with expressions of disbelief. Some couldn't stop looking toward the church entrance where the old yellow Kiki was still parked outside. One young man quietly whispered to his friend, "I thought the Kiki was dropping someone off." His friend chuckled. "No, that was actually the groom." Both of them laughed again. Across the aisle, Vivian sat beside her mother, unable to hide her embarrassment. She leaned closer. "Mom, people are recording everything." Mrs. Johnson covered part of her face with a handkerchief. "I don't even want to look around." Chief Benson sat in the front row with his shoulders stiff. Every whisper felt like a knife piercing his pride. He had spent decades building a respected name in the community. Now he believed his daughter's wedding was destroying it in a single morning. Meanwhile, Michael Harrison sat calmly in an expensive black suit. A small smile rested on his face. He watched David carefully. "So this is the man she chose over me," he murmured. The pastor stepped forward and welcomed everyone. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of David Cole and Grace Johnson in holy matrimony." Normally, weddings were filled with excitement and joyful smiles. This one felt different. The atmosphere was heavy. People looked more curious than happy. Some guests weren't even trying to hide that they were sending messages on their phones. One woman secretly typed in a family group chat, "You won't believe what I'm witnessing." The groom arrived in an old Kiki. Everyone is laughing. Within seconds, replies poured in. "Please send pictures." "Is this real?" "Poor bride." The woman secretly snapped a photo. Across the church, another guest quietly started a live video on social media. Thousands of viewers began watching. Comments flooded the screen. "She deserves better. Why would she marry him? Maybe he's the only man she could find. This is so embarrassing." None of them knew the truth. The pastor smiled warmly. Marriage is built on love, sacrifice, trust, and commitment. David listened attentively. Grace nodded gently. The pastor continued, "It is not built on money alone." Those words caused several people to exchange amused glances. One man whispered sarcastically, "That's good, because this groom doesn't seem to have any." A few nearby guests laughed quietly. David heard them. He simply smiled. Grace noticed. "You always smile," she whispered. "It's cheaper than arguing," David replied softly. Grace laughed quietly for the first time that morning. The simple sound caught the attention of a few guests. Instead of looking ashamed, the bride looked happy. Truly happy. That confused everyone. The pastor invited the couple to stand before him. "My children," he said kindly. "Before we proceed, I want to ask one final question." He looked at Grace. "My daughter, are you entering this marriage willingly?" Without hesitation, Grace answered firmly, "Yes." Her voice echoed throughout the church. There wasn't the slightest trace of uncertainty. The pastor smiled. "And are you certain this is the man you wish to spend your life with?" Grace turned toward David. She looked into his warm brown eyes. Memories flashed through her mind. The rainy afternoon when he repaired her broken car without asking for payment. The evenings he volunteered at orphanages. The countless times he encouraged her after difficult days at work. The way he respected everyone, from security guards to market women. She smiled. "More certain than I've ever been about anything." The church became unusually quiet. Even those who mocked her couldn't ignore the sincerity in her voice. The pastor then faced David. "My son, do you promise to love, protect, honor, and cherish Grace all the days of your life?" David looked at Grace with deep affection. "I do. I also ask you this." The pastor paused. "If life becomes difficult," David listened carefully. "If wealth disappears, Several guests exchanged knowing smiles. If sickness comes, David nodded. If people reject both of you, his answer came immediately. I will never leave her. Grace blinked rapidly as tears gathered in her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of overwhelming love. The pastor smiled warmly. I believe you. From the front row, Mrs. Johnson quietly wiped away a tear. For a brief moment, even she could see how genuine David's love was. But Chief Benson remained unmoved. Love was not enough in his eyes. Not when there were bills to pay and reputations to protect. The ceremony continued. Then came the exchange of vows. David reached into his jacket and unfolded a neatly written piece of paper. He cleared his throat. Grace. His calm voice filled the church. The day I met you, I realized kindness still existed. Grace smiled through her tears. You never cared about what I owned. Several guests rolled their eyes. You never judged where I came from. David continued. You respected me when I had nothing to offer except my heart. He paused. I cannot promise that every day will be easy. Grace squeezed his hands gently. But I promise you'll never face those days alone. Silence filled the church. For the first time since the ceremony began, no one whispered. No one laughed. Even the people recording lowered their phones. David folded the paper. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that loving you will always be the best decision I've ever made. Grace could no longer hold back her tears. When it was her turn, she didn't use any prepared notes. She simply spoke from her heart. David. Her voice trembled. I know people think I've made a mistake. She glanced briefly at the congregation. I've heard every whisper. Several guests lowered their eyes. I've seen every laugh. The church became even quieter. But they don't know the man I know. She turned back toward David. They don't know your kindness. They don't know your patience. They don't know your generosity. They don't know your heart. David swallowed hard. Grace smiled lovingly. I would rather spend my life with a good man riding in a kiki than with a cruel man driving the most expensive car in the world. Collective gasp swept through the church. Even Chief Benson looked stunned. Grace continued. I don't need a rich husband. She gently placed her hand over David's. I need this man. For several seconds, absolute silence filled the sanctuary. Then, unexpectedly, an elderly widow seated near the back slowly stood to her feet. She began clapping. Everyone turned toward her. I know this young man, she said loudly. Heads turned in surprise. He repaired my roof after a storm and refused to take a single naira. She smiled warmly at David. He's one of the finest men I've ever met. Another elderly man stood. He paid for my grandson's school fees 3 years ago. A middle-aged woman rose next. He bought medicine for my husband when we couldn't afford it. One by one, a few people who had personally experienced David's quiet kindness stood in support of him. The whispers in the church slowly changed. Really? I didn't know that. Neither did I. Chief Benson frowned. He had never heard any of these stories. David had never spoken about them. Grace smiled proudly. This was the man she loved. Not because of what he owned, but because of who he was. Yet hidden beneath David's humble smile was a truth so astonishing that no one inside the church could possibly imagine it. Before the wedding celebration ended, the same people who pitted Grace would discover that the quiet mechanic they mocked was not just a good man. He was the richest man in town. The church ceremony ended with applause, though it was far less enthusiastic than Grace had imagined when she dreamed about her wedding day. As David and Grace walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, a few guests clapped politely. Others remained seated with blank expressions, while many secretly continued recording videos on their phones. Outside, photographers called for the couple to pose. Smile! David smiled naturally. Grace smiled even brighter. The cameras flashed repeatedly. Yet many guests paid little attention to the newlyweds. Instead, they gathered in small groups, whispering and laughing. I still can't get over that old kiki. It looked ready for the scrapyard. I've never seen such embarrassment. Grace overheard the comments but refused to let them steal her joy. She slipped her arm through David's. "Ready for the reception?" she asked. David looked at her with admiration. "As long as I'm with you," she smiled. "Then let's go." The reception hall was decorated like a royal banquet. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and elegant white and gold decorations covered every table. Soft music filled the air as waiters served chilled drinks to the guests. David noticed that many people deliberately avoided sitting near him. Several empty chairs surrounded the table reserved for the bride and groom. One guest quietly whispered, "I don't want people thinking we're friends with that poor mechanic." His wife nodded and chose another table. David simply pulled out a chair for Grace. "Please, my queen." Grace laughed softly. "Thank you." She sat down and David took his seat beside her. Neither of them seemed bothered by the empty chairs around them. Across the hall, Michael Harrison watched them with narrowed eyes. His expensive designer suit, polished shoes, and gold wristwatch drew admiration from many guests. Several businessmen walked over to greet him. "Michael, you should have been the groom. You and Grace would have made the perfect couple. What a shame." Michael accepted their compliments with a confident smile. "Sometimes people make foolish decisions," he replied. Chief Benson walked over and sighed heavily. "I've never been so humiliated in my life." Michael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, Chief." Chief Benson looked at him. "There may still be a way to fix this." The older man frowned. "What do you mean?" Michael smiled confidently. "Watch." Without another word, he picked up a microphone from the master of ceremonies. The lively music faded. The room became quiet. Michael stood at the center of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with a charming smile, "may I have everyone's attention for just a few minutes?" Guests turned toward him. Some assumed he was about to offer congratulations. Grace looked confused. David remained calm. Michael continued, "Today should have been one of the happiest days of Grace's life." He paused dramatically, but instead, he looked directly at David. "She has made the biggest mistake of her life." A wave of murmurs spread across the hall. Grace's smile disappeared. Michael ignored her reaction. "I have known Grace for years." He smiled at her. "She deserves the best." Several guests nodded. "She deserves comfort." More nods. "She deserves security." Even louder agreement. Michael slowly turned toward David. "But tell me," his voice became sharper, "what exactly can this man offer her?" Silence filled the hall. David remained seated. Michael continued walking across the stage. "Can he buy her the life she deserves?" No answer. "Can he provide luxury?" Silence. "Can he protect her from poverty?" The crowd began whispering again. Michael smiled proudly. "I can." A few guests applauded. Grace stood up. "Michael!" He raised a hand politely. "Please, Grace, let me finish." She reluctantly sat back down. Michael looked around the hall. "I own hotels." Several guests nodded. "I own estates." More applause. "I have investments across the country." Chief Benson smiled proudly. Michael then faced Grace again. "I loved you." His voice softened. "I still do." The hall became completely silent. "I begged you to choose me." Grace lowered her eyes. "You refused." Michael took a deep breath. "But because I truly care about you." He extended his hand toward her. "I'm giving you one final opportunity." Gasps echoed around the room. "Leave this wedding." The words stunned everyone. "Marry me instead." Even the musicians stopped playing. Grace stared at him in disbelief. Chief Benson's eyes widened. Some guests whispered excitedly, "Did he just say that? This is unbelievable." Michael stepped down from the stage and slowly approached Grace. "I'll pretend today never happened." He smiled confidently. "We can have another wedding." He pointed toward David. "You don't have to waste your life." Every camera in the room turned toward Grace. People held their breath. Would she actually leave her husband on their wedding day? Michael stretched out his hand once more. "Come with me." The room was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioner seemed unusually loud. Grace slowly stood. She looked at Michael. Then she looked at David. David's expression remained peaceful. He neither interrupted nor pleaded. He simply trusted her. Grace took one step forward. The crowd leaned in. Then, she walked past Michael. She stopped beside David instead. Without saying a word, she gently held David's hand. The hall erupted with murmurs. Grace finally turned toward Michael. "You asked what my husband can offer me." Michael smiled confidently. "Yes." She looked directly into his eyes. "He offers me something you never could." Michael frowned. "And what's that?" "Respect." The smile disappeared from his face. Grace continued. "He has never tried to control me." Silence. "He has never insulted anyone to make himself look important." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. "He has never used money to measure a person's worth." Michael's jaw tightened. Grace's voice became firmer. "You think wealth makes someone valuable." She gently squeezed David's hand. "But character is worth far more." The hall remained silent. Michael forced a laugh. "So you'd rather live in poverty?" Grace smiled. "If loving my husband means living in a one-room apartment." She looked proudly at David. "I'll gladly sweep the floor every morning with joy." A few elderly women smiled. Others looked away in shame. Michael's face darkened. "So that's your final answer?" Grace nodded. "It is." Michael's voice grew colder. "You'll regret this." Before Grace could respond, David calmly stood. The room immediately became quiet again. Everyone expected an argument. Instead, David walked toward Michael with a gentle smile. He extended his hand. "Thank you." Michael blinked. "For what?" "For loving Grace enough to want the best for her." Michael stared at him. David continued calmly. "I truly hope one day you find someone who loves you the way Grace loves me." The unexpected kindness caught everyone off guard. Michael refused to shake his hand. Instead, he scoffed. "You should thank me." David tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "Because compared to me." Michael looked him up and down with open contempt. "You're nothing." Several guests nodded in agreement. David slowly withdrew his hand. His smile never faded. "If that's what you believe," he said quietly, "then I hope life proves you right." Michael laughed mockingly. "It already has." David simply nodded. "Perhaps." As he returned to Grace's side, his phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen unnoticed. It was a single message from his personal assistant. "Sir, the convoy has arrived outside town. Awaiting your instruction." David locked the screen without replying. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and smiled at Grace. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Grace nodded. "I am now." Neither of them noticed Samuel standing quietly near the entrance with a knowing smile. He checked his own watch. The time had almost come. Within the next hour, the reception hall would witness a revelation so astonishing that every insult, every laugh, and every word of humiliation spoken against David would return to haunt those who had uttered them. A heavy silence settled over the reception hall after the confrontation between Michael Harrison and the newlyweds. Although the musicians eventually resumed playing soft instrumental music, the joyful atmosphere had vanished. Guests continued whispering among themselves, replaying the dramatic scene they had just witnessed. "Did you see how Michael begged her? I thought she would leave. I still don't understand why she chose that mechanic." At the head table, Grace and David quietly ate from their plates. Neither of them seemed interested in the gossip surrounding them. Grace noticed David had barely touched his food. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked softly. David smiled. "I am." "Then why aren't you eating?" He looked around the room. "I'm waiting." "For what?" "The right moment." Grace frowned slightly. She had learned during their 2 years together that David often spoke in ways she didn't fully understand. Yet somehow his words always made sense later. She simply nodded. "I trust you." David smiled warmly. "And that means more to me than you know." Across the hall, Chief Benson sat with folded arms, his face clouded with anger and disappointment. Every laugh, every whisper, every pitying glance from the guests felt like an insult to his family's reputation. Finally, he could bear it no longer. He stood abruptly, picked up a microphone from the master of ceremonies, and slowly walked onto the stage. The room gradually fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, forcing a smile that failed to hide the pain in his voice. "Thank you all for honoring my invitation today." The guests looked toward him expectantly. Chief Benson took a deep breath. "I have spent my entire life building a name that people respect." He glanced at Grace. "I worked day and night to provide my daughters with the best education, the best opportunities, and the best future." His voice grew heavier. "I dreamed that my youngest daughter would marry a man who could protect her, provide for her, and continue the legacy of this family." Grace lowered her eyes. She knew where this speech was heading. Chief Benson turned toward David. "But dreams don't always come true." A murmur spread across the hall. He pointed openly at David. "This young man may be kind." He paused. "He may even love my daughter." Another pause. "But love alone cannot feed a family." Several guests nodded. "It cannot build businesses. More agreement. It cannot protect my daughter from hardship." Chief Benson's voice echoed across the hall. "And because my daughter refused to listen to wisdom." He stopped for a moment before saying the words that would leave everyone stunned. "From this moment forward, I no longer recognize Grace Johnson as my daughter." A collective gasp swept through the reception hall. Mrs. Johnson immediately stood up. "Benson!" Her voice trembled. "What are you saying?" Chief Benson looked at his wife. "I'm saying exactly what I mean." Grace stared at her father in disbelief. Tears instantly filled her eyes. "Father!" He raised a hand. "No." His face remained hard. "You made your choice." His voice cracked ever so slightly. "Now live with it." Grace slowly stood from her chair. She walked toward him, tears rolling freely down her cheeks. "Please." She reached for his hand. "I never wanted to hurt you." Chief Benson pulled his hand away. "You already have." The rejection broke her heart. The little girl who had once run into her father's arms after school every afternoon now stood before him as a stranger. The guests watched in complete silence. Even those who had mocked David earlier began feeling uncomfortable. Mrs. Johnson rushed toward Grace and hugged her tightly. "My daughter," she sobbed. "Please forgive your father." Grace embraced her mother. "I've already forgiven him." Chief Benson looked away. His pride refused to let him soften. Vivian folded her arms. "If you ask me," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "Father is doing the right thing." Grace turned slowly. "Vivian, you chose a poor man over your own family." Vivian shrugged. "You made your decision." Grace looked at her sister with sadness rather than anger. "I never stopped loving any of you." Vivian looked away. David finally rose from his chair and walked calmly toward Grace. Without saying a word, he gently wiped the tears from her face with his handkerchief. "It's all right," he whispered. Grace shook her head. "No." Her voice trembled. "It's not." He smiled gently. "It will be." She looked into his eyes. "How can you still be so calm?" David simply replied, "Because storms never last forever." His peaceful confidence puzzled everyone. Michael, however, laughed quietly. "I admire your optimism." David turned toward him. "So do I." Michael smirked. "You've just been rejected by your wife's family." David nodded. "Yes. And you're smiling." "I am." Michael laughed again. "I've never met anyone like you." David smiled. "Neither have I." Just then, one of the waiters hurried toward the entrance. He whispered something to the master of ceremonies. The MC's eyes widened. He quickly walked over to Chief Benson. "Sir." Chief Benson frowned. "What is it?" "There are some visitors asking for the groom." The chief frowned. "The groom?" "Yes." "Who are they?" The MC hesitated. "I've never seen people like them before." "What do you mean?" "They're dressed in expensive black suits." Chief Benson sighed impatiently. Probably debt collectors. Several nearby guests laughed. Michael chuckled. Maybe the mechanic borrowed money to pay for this wedding. The laughter spread again. David remained silent. Outside the reception hall, several men in perfectly tailored black suits stood beside a sleek black vehicle. Their polished shoes reflected the afternoon sunlight. Each man wore a small communication earpiece. They stood with military-like discipline. One of them held a thick brown leather briefcase. Another carried a large sealed envelope. The hotel security guards looked nervous. Who are these people? I don't know. They look important. Back inside, the MC approached David respectfully. Sir. David looked up. There are some gentlemen outside asking specifically for you. David smiled politely. Please tell them to wait a little longer. The MC blinked. You know them. I do. Should I invite them inside? David looked at Grace. She was still trying to compose herself after her father's rejection. He gently squeezed her hand. Not yet. The MC nodded and hurried back outside. The guests exchanged curious glances. Michael laughed again. Looks like even poor people can have visitors. Chief Benson shook his head. I hope they don't cause another embarrassment. Samuel, who had been quietly observing everything from the back of the hall, smiled to himself. He checked his watch. Only a few more minutes. He looked toward the entrance where the men in black suits continued waiting patiently. Then he looked at David. David gave him the smallest nod. Samuel understood immediately. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. The greatest test was almost over. The people who had judged David by the old Kiki, the father who had disowned his own daughter, the man who believed wealth made him superior, and the guests who laughed without knowing the truth. None of them realized that the next few moments would change their lives forever. The humble mechanic they had mocked was about to reveal a secret so extraordinary that every insult spoken that day would become a source of lifelong shame. The old Kiki parked quietly outside the venue was no symbol of poverty. It was the final piece of a test that was about to expose every heart in the room. The reception hall remained unusually quiet. Most of the guests had lost interest in the food. Instead, they kept glancing toward the entrance, wondering who the mysterious visitors could be. Chief Benson sat stiffly in his chair, still refusing to look at Grace. Michael Harrison leaned back with folded arms, wearing a confident smile. I'm sure this will be another embarrassment, he whispered to one of his friends. His friend chuckled. Maybe the mechanic's landlord came to collect rent. A few people nearby laughed. David heard them, but his expression never changed. He simply reached for Grace's hand beneath the table. She looked at him. You've been smiling all day, she whispered. I have. Even after everything that happened. David gently brushed a tear from her cheek. Because I know this pain won't last. Grace searched his face. There are moments today when I feel like I don't know what you're thinking. David smiled warmly. You'll understand very soon. Before Grace could ask another question, the master of ceremonies hurried onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced nervously. May I have your attention, please? The room slowly became silent. There are some distinguished visitors here to see the groom. Guests exchanged puzzled looks. Chief Benson frowned. Distinguished visitors? Michael laughed softly. This should be interesting. The large entrance doors slowly opened. Every head turned. 6 men dressed in perfectly tailored black suits walked into the hall in a neat formation. Each of them wore white gloves and communication earpieces. Their polished shoes reflected the bright lights hanging from the ceiling. Their expressions were serious and professional. The laughter in the room faded immediately. Who are they? They look like government officials. No, they look like executive security. Behind them came another group carrying elegant leather briefcases. Then another, and another. The guests watched in complete silence. Even Chief Benson looked confused. The men stopped a few steps away from David. Then, to everyone's astonishment, they bowed respectfully. The leader spoke clearly. Good afternoon, Chairman. The word echoed through the hall. Chairman? Several guests frowned. Michael laughed. Chairman of what? The leader ignored him. He looked at David. Sir, everything is ready. David nodded calmly. Thank you. The man standing beside the leader stepped forward and handed David a thick brown envelope. David accepted it. He looked at Grace. Would you stand beside me? She nodded, still completely confused. Together they walked toward the center of the reception hall. Every eye followed them. David turned toward the guests. I know many of you are wondering what's happening. Nobody answered. He smiled gently. I think it's time you knew the truth. Michael folded his arms. We're listening. David looked toward the leader of the men in black suits. You may begin. The man opened a leather folder. His voice was calm and professional. My name is Emmanuel Okafor. He paused. I serve as the Chief Legal Officer of Cole Global Holdings. The name sounded familiar to many of the businessmen in the room. One guest whispered, Cole Global. Another nodded slowly. That's the largest business group in the state. The lawyer continued. Cole Global Holdings owns shopping malls. He turned a page. Luxury hotels. Another page. Construction companies. Another. Real estate developments. Another. Oil service companies. Another. Transportation firms. Another. And several charitable foundations operating across Nigeria. The room grew completely silent. Michael's confident smile slowly disappeared. Chief Benson leaned forward. The lawyer continued. The founder, owner, and executive chairman of Cole Global Holdings. He closed the file. Is Mr. David Cole. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as though the entire hall had forgotten how to breathe. What? A woman accidentally dropped her glass onto the floor. It shattered loudly. Still, nobody reacted. Michael laughed nervously. This has to be some kind of joke. The lawyer calmly removed another document from the briefcase. It is not. He handed copies to several respected businessmen seated in the front row. One of them adjusted his glasses. His eyes widened. These are genuine incorporation documents. Another businessman quickly examined them. They're authentic. A third looked up at David with disbelief. My God! The lawyer continued. Mr. David Cole is the majority shareholder of every company listed in these documents. The hall erupted into loud murmurs. No way! Impossible! It can't be! Grace stared at David. Her lips parted slightly. You! She could barely speak. David smiled softly. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you earlier. Tears filled Grace's eyes. You were telling the truth. David nodded. I just needed to know. Know what? He looked around the hall. Who loved me without knowing what I owned? Silence returned. David slowly walked toward the large windows overlooking the parking area. He pointed outside. If you'll excuse me. Everyone rushed toward the windows. Outside, the old yellow Kiki still stood exactly where Baba Musa had parked it. Beside it, one after another, more than 50 gleaming luxury SUVs rolled into the compound. Black Range Rovers, Mercedes-Benz G-Class vehicles, Lexus LX SUVs, Escalades. Their polished bodies sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Behind them came 2 Rolls-Royces. Guests gasped. What is happening? Uniformed security officers stepped out of the vehicles with disciplined precision. Each one took position. The convoy stretched almost beyond the gate. People outside the venue stopped walking to stare. Children gathered near the fence in amazement. Inside the hall, complete silence filled the room. Chief Benson's hands began trembling. Michael's face turned pale. Vivian covered her mouth in shock. Mrs. Johnson could hardly believe her eyes. David turned back toward the guests. I could have arrived in any one of those vehicles. His calm voice echoed through the hall. I chose not to. He looked toward the old yellow Kiki outside. I asked Baba Musa to bring me here because that Kiki reminds me where I started. The elderly driver, who had quietly remained outside, lowered his head with emotion. David smiled. When I was a teenager, Baba Musa often gave me free rides when I couldn't afford transport. The old man's eyes filled with tears. I never forgot. David continued. So today, he looked around the hall. I honored him. Several guests lowered their heads in shame. David slowly faced Chief Benson. You judged me because of the vehicle I arrived in. Chief Benson could not speak. You believed wealth could only be recognized by expensive cars. The older man's eyes filled with tears. David then looked toward Michael. You believed money made you better than others. Michael stared silently at the floor. David sighed softly. I never wanted to embarrass anyone. He paused. I only wanted to know who would still respect me if they believed I had nothing. His eyes settled on Grace. And only one person passed that test. Grace could no longer hold back her tears. She rushed into David's arms. You should have told me, she whispered through sobs. David embraced her tightly. If I had, he smiled, I would never have known whether you loved me or my wealth. Grace looked up at him. I would choose you 1,000 times. David kissed her forehead. I know. Across the hall, guests who had mocked the humble groom now stood frozen with regret. The phones that had recorded him arriving in the old Kiki were still in their hands. Only now, those videos no longer captured a poor mechanic. They captured one of the richest and most respected men in the entire town. A man whose wealth had been hidden behind humility, and whose greatest treasure had been the woman who loved him before anyone else knew the truth. And for those who had laughed, their laughter had turned into the deepest humiliation they had ever experienced. For several long moments after David's revelation, no one in the reception hall spoke. The lively music had stopped. The waiters stood frozen where they were. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The same guests who had laughed when David arrived in an old Kiki now stared at him with wide eyes. The atmosphere had completely changed. The laughter was gone. In its place was overwhelming shame. David stood quietly beside Grace, one arm around her shoulders. His expression remained calm, without the slightest trace of pride or revenge. He had not revealed his identity to humiliate anyone. He had only revealed the truth. The silence was finally broken by one of the elderly businessmen sitting near the front. He slowly walked toward David. I owe you an apology. David smiled politely. There is no need. The elderly man shook his head. There is. His voice trembled. I judged you before I even knew your name. He lowered his head. I am ashamed of myself. David gently placed a hand on the man's shoulder. We all make mistakes. The businessman nodded gratefully before returning to his seat. His apology seemed to open the floodgates. One after another, guests began walking toward David. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I shouldn't have laughed. I judged you because of your appearance. Some could barely meet his eyes. Others wiped away tears of embarrassment. David greeted every single person with the same warm smile. I forgive you. He never raised his voice. He never reminded anyone of their insults. His humility only made the guests feel even more ashamed. Grace watched him with admiration. She whispered softly, How do you do it? David looked at her. Do what? Forgive people so easily. He smiled gently. If I hold on to anger, then their actions continue to control my heart. Grace squeezed his hand. I think that's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. David chuckled softly. I was hoping there were a few more reasons. Grace laughed through her tears. There are. Across the hall, Vivian remained frozen. The confident woman who had mocked her sister all day could barely breathe. Images flashed through her mind. She remembered laughing when David stepped out of the old Kiki. She remembered calling him a poor mechanic. She remembered telling Grace she had ruined her life. Now every cruel word echoed painfully inside her heart. Slowly, she walked toward her younger sister. Grace. Grace turned. Vivian's eyes were red with tears. I'm so sorry. Grace looked at her quietly. Vivian wiped her face. I treated you terribly. Her voice cracked. I mocked the man you love. She looked at David. I insulted you without even knowing you. David smiled kindly. You don't have to apologize because I'm rich. Vivian quickly shook her head. No. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. I'm apologizing because I behaved like someone I don't recognize. She lowered her head. I became proud. Grace stepped forward and hugged her sister. Vivian burst into tears. I'm sorry. Grace held her tightly. I forgave you a long time ago. The sisters remained in each other's arms while many guests quietly wiped away tears. Mrs. Johnson watched the emotional reunion with gratitude. But one person still hadn't moved. Chief Benson. He remained seated in his chair, staring blankly at the floor. His walking stick rested beside him. His shoulders looked heavier than anyone had ever seen. For the first time in decades, the proud businessman looked completely broken. Mrs. Johnson walked over and gently touched his shoulder. Benson. He didn't answer. Our daughter is waiting. His eyes slowly filled with tears. I failed. No. She knelt beside him. You still have a chance. Chief Benson looked toward Grace. She was laughing softly with David. Despite everything he had done, she still looked happy. His heart ached. Very slowly he stood. The hall became silent once again as everyone watched him. Step by step he walked toward David and Grace. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he finally reached them, he looked first at Grace. His voice was barely above a whisper. My daughter. Grace immediately turned. He struggled to continue. I said terrible things. Tears streamed down his face. I disowned you. His shoulders shook. I broke your heart. Grace's own tears returned. Chief Benson slowly lowered himself to his knees. A loud gasp echoed through the hall. The proud man whom everyone respected, the man who had never knelt before anyone, was now kneeling before his daughter and her husband. Forgive me. The words came out broken. I let my pride become more important than my child. Grace quickly bent down. Father, please don't kneel. But Chief Benson remained where he was. I judged David because I saw an old Kiki. His voice trembled. I never looked at his heart. He turned toward David. My son. David looked surprised. I don't deserve to call you that. Chief Benson wiped away his tears. But if there is even the smallest place in your heart. He bowed his head. Please forgive an old fool. The entire hall watched in complete silence. David reached down immediately and gently held Chief Benson's hands. No, sir. He carefully helped him to his feet. You should never kneel before me. Chief Benson looked into David's eyes. After everything I did, David smiled warmly. You were trying to protect your daughter. Chief Benson shook his head. I was protecting my pride. David nodded slowly. Maybe. He paused. But today we can choose something better. Chief Benson's lips trembled. You still forgive me? David smiled. With all my heart. The older man could no longer hold back his emotions. He embraced David tightly. The reception hall erupted into applause. Many guests openly cried. Even the photographers struggled to keep their cameras steady. Michael Harrison watched everything from across the room. Unlike everyone else, he had not apologized. His pride still fought against the truth. Samuel quietly walked over to him. You should apologize. Michael laughed bitterly. To him. Samuel nodded. He deserves it. Michael looked toward David. I mocked him. Yes. I called him nothing. Yes. I tried to steal his bride on their wedding day. Samuel folded his arms. And yet I believe he'd still forgive you. Michael remained silent. After several moments, he slowly walked toward David. The hall became quiet again. When he reached David, he took a deep breath. I don't expect forgiveness. David listened without speaking. Michael continued. I've spent my entire life believing money made me important. He looked down. Today I learned that character is worth more than wealth. He extended his hand. I'm sorry. David looked at the offered hand for a brief moment. Then he smiled. He shook it firmly. I forgive you. Michael blinked. Just like that. David nodded. I have no reason to carry yesterday into tomorrow. Michael smiled weakly. I hope one day I become half the man you are. David chuckled. You'll become an even better one. For the first time that day, Michael smiled sincerely. The atmosphere inside the reception hall transformed completely. The same guests who had arrived expecting a glamorous wedding had witnessed something far greater. They had witnessed pride humbled, forgiveness freely given, and love proven stronger than wealth. As the musicians slowly began playing again, the celebration finally felt like a real wedding. Yet outside, the old yellow Kiki still stood quietly beside the long line of luxury vehicles. It remained exactly where David had left it, not because he needed it anymore, but because it had become the greatest teacher of the day. It had revealed every heart before revealing the richest man in town. And no amount of wealth could ever teach a lesson more valuable than that. 3 months had passed since the unforgettable wedding. Although life had returned to normal for most people in town, the story of the groom who arrived in an old Kiki was still the topic of countless conversations. People no longer laughed when they mentioned the wedding. Instead, they spoke about it with admiration. The richest man in town came in a Kiki just to test people's hearts. I'll never judge anyone by appearance again. What Grace saw in him was something money couldn't buy. The story spread beyond the town, reaching neighboring cities and eventually becoming a lesson many parents shared with their children. Meanwhile, David and Grace settled into married life. To Grace, very little had changed. David still woke up early every morning. He still greeted every employee with respect. He still visited Baba Musa every weekend, often sitting with the elderly Kiki driver under the shade of a mango tree to drink tea and talk about life. His wealth had never changed his character. If anything, Grace admired him even more now that she knew the truth. One Saturday morning, the couple drove to Baba Musa's modest home in one of David's luxury SUVs. As they stepped out, Baba Musa hurried toward them with a wide smile. "My children!" He embraced them warmly. "You didn't have to come all this way." David laughed. "We promised we'd visit." Baba Musa looked at the beautiful house standing behind him. "I still can't believe this belongs to me." Grace smiled. "You deserve it." The elderly man's eyes became misty. "For years, I thought I had nothing to offer the world." David gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You offered kindness when you gave a struggling young man free rides in your Kiki." He smiled. "I never forgot." Baba Musa wiped away his tears. "And I never imagined those small acts of kindness would one day return to me." As they sat together, Grace quietly reflected on how a simple act of generosity had changed someone's life forever. It reminded her why she had fallen in love with David. Back in town, however, life was not as peaceful for everyone. Chief Benson had become a changed man. The proud businessman who once measured people by their wealth now spent many sleepless nights thinking about his mistakes. He replayed the wedding day over and over in his mind. Every laugh, every insult, every harsh word he had spoken to his own daughter. The memories filled him with regret. His business reputation had also begun to suffer. Several longtime partners quietly ended negotiations with him. Not because he was poor or unsuccessful, but because they questioned his judgment. If he could treat his own daughter that way, one investor remarked, how would he treat his business partners? Another added, character matters more than money. Chief Benson realized that respect earned over decades could be damaged by a single day of pride. One afternoon, he visited David's office. The building was one of the tallest in the city, with glass walls that reflected the bright afternoon sun. The receptionist welcomed him warmly. "Good afternoon, Chief Benson." He smiled politely. "I'd like to see David." "Certainly, sir." Minutes later, David personally came downstairs instead of asking his father-in-law to come up. "Father," David said with a smile. Chief Benson's eyes filled with emotion. "You still call me that?" David nodded. "Of course." The older man lowered his head. "I don't deserve it." David gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Families heal by moving forward, not by staying trapped in yesterday. Those words touched Chief Benson deeply. Meanwhile, Vivian had also begun changing. She started volunteering at a local orphanage every weekend. The children there didn't know she came from a wealthy family. They only knew her as the cheerful woman who read them stories and played games with them. For the first time in years, Vivian discovered joy in serving others instead of seeking attention. One evening, she visited Grace. "I've been thinking," Vivian admitted. Grace smiled. "About what?" "About how empty my life used to be." Grace listened quietly. "I spent years chasing status." Vivian looked down at her hands. "But watching you and David," she smiled softly, "you've shown me what really matters." Grace hugged her sister. "It's never too late to change." Across town, Michael Harrison also reflected on the lesson he had learned. Instead of competing with others, he began using his wealth to create scholarships for students from low-income families. He no longer sought recognition. For the first time, he understood that money had its greatest value when it improved someone else's life. As for David, he never mentioned the wedding again. He never boasted about what had happened. Instead, he quietly expanded his charitable foundation, funding hospitals, schools, and vocational training centers across the state. When reporters asked why he gave away so much of his fortune, his answer was always the same. "Real wealth isn't measured by what you keep," he said with a gentle smile. "It's measured by how many lives become better because you lived." Grace watched him from the audience during one charity event and smiled with pride. She realized that the greatest blessing in her life wasn't that she had married the richest man in town. It was that she had married the kindest one. And every day that followed their remarkable wedding proved that true riches were never found in luxury cars, grand houses, or overflowing bank accounts. They were found in humble hearts, generous hands, and the courage to love people for who they truly were. A year passed after David and Grace's unforgettable wedding. Life had changed in many ways, but one thing remained exactly the same. David still treated Grace with the same love and respect he had shown her when everyone believed he was nothing more than a poor mechanic. Every morning, they shared breakfast together before beginning their day. David never allowed his busy schedule to become an excuse for neglecting his wife. No matter how many meetings filled his calendar or how many business deals demanded his attention, he always made time for Grace. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of their home watching the sunset, Grace smiled and said, "Sometimes I still can't believe all of this is real." David looked at her with amusement. "What part?" She laughed softly. "The beautiful house." She pointed toward the well-kept gardens. "The staff." She smiled again. "The companies." Then she looked into his eyes. "And the fact that my husband is the richest man in town." David chuckled. "I hope that's not the reason you love me." Grace playfully nudged his shoulder. "You know it isn't." "I know." She leaned her head against him. "I would still marry you if you arrived in that old Kiki every single day." David laughed wholeheartedly. "I believe you." Grace looked thoughtful. "You know what amazes me?" "What?" "You had every reason to become proud." David shook his head. "Pride makes people forget where they came from." His eyes drifted toward the horizon. "I never want to forget." A few days later, David invited Grace to accompany him to the grand opening of a new charitable foundation. Thousands of people gathered in the city square. Business leaders, community elders, journalists, teachers, students, and families filled the venue. Large banners decorated the stage, but they were covered with elegant white cloth, hiding whatever had been written beneath. Grace looked at David curiously. "What are you planning?" David smiled mysteriously. "You'll find out soon." The ceremony began with music and prayers before David was invited to the stage. The crowd erupted into applause. Although he had become one of the country's most respected businessmen, David still walked to the podium with the same quiet humility that had won Grace's heart. He greeted the audience warmly. "Good afternoon, everyone." The applause slowly faded. "Many people know me as a businessman." He smiled. "But before I became successful, I was simply a young man with dreams and very little money." The audience listened attentively. "I learned that life can change because one person believes in you." He looked toward Grace, who sat in the front row. "For me, that person was my wife." Grace's eyes widened. David continued, When the world saw an ordinary mechanic, she saw a good man. The crowd applauded. When others laughed at the old Kiki I arrived in, she held my hand with pride. Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes. When her own family rejected her, she never rejected me. The audience grew quiet. I have built companies. He paused. I have built houses. Another pause. I have built wealth. He smiled warmly. But none of those achievements compare to building a life with a woman whose love never depended on money. The applause became even louder. David looked toward one of his assistants standing beside the stage. It's time. The assistant nodded and pressed a small remote. The white cloth covering the large sign behind the stage slowly fell away. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Written in large golden letters were the words, "The Grace Johnson Foundation." Beneath it was the foundation's motto, "Changing lives through love, kindness, and opportunity." Grace covered her mouth in surprise. She turned toward David in disbelief. "You?" She could barely speak. David smiled. "This foundation belongs to you." The audience stood to their feet, applauding enthusiastically. Grace slowly walked onto the stage. Tears streamed down her face. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. David gently took her hands. "You deserve far more." He looked at the audience. "My wife taught me that kindness is never wasted." He smiled proudly. "This foundation will provide scholarships for children, support widows, build schools, and create opportunities for families who have been forgotten." The applause echoed across the square. Journalists quickly began taking photographs. Many people wiped away tears. One reporter asked loudly, "Mr. Cole, why did you name it after your wife instead of yourself?" David smiled. "Because I want the world to remember the woman who loved me before she knew my name could open doors." The audience applauded again. Grace could no longer hold back her emotions. She embraced David tightly. "You've given me more than I ever dreamed of," she whispered. David smiled. "No." He gently touched her cheek. "You gave me something money could never buy." "What is that?" "A heart I never had to question." Those standing closest to the stage smiled warmly. Their love was genuine. It wasn't built on wealth or status. It had survived humiliation, rejection, and public ridicule. As the ceremony continued, several scholarship recipients were invited onto the stage. Among them was a young girl whose widowed mother struggled to pay school fees. Another was a boy who dreamed of becoming a doctor but had almost abandoned his education because of poverty. David and Grace personally presented each child with their scholarship certificates. Grace knelt beside the youngest girl and smiled. "Study hard." The little girl nodded excitedly. "I will, ma'am." Watching from the crowd, Chief Benson felt his heart overflow with pride. Not because David was wealthy, but because his daughter had become a woman who inspired hope wherever she went. Mrs. Johnson gently squeezed his hand. "We raised a wonderful daughter." Chief Benson smiled through misty eyes. "Yes." He looked toward David. "And she married an even better man." As the sun began to set, the celebration ended with joyful music and laughter. People left the venue inspired by what they had witnessed. The story of the old Kiki was no longer just about a billionaire hiding his wealth. It had become a story about choosing love over pride, kindness over status, and humility over riches. Everywhere they went, people affectionately referred to Grace as the queen beside the king. Not because she wore expensive clothes or lived in a magnificent mansion, but because she had stood beside the man she loved long before the world knew he was a king in every sense of the word. 5 years later, the story of the groom who arrived at his wedding in an old yellow Kiki had become more than just a memory. It had become a legend. Parents shared it with their children before bedtime. Teachers told it in classrooms when explaining the importance of humility and kindness. Pastors used it in sermons to remind their congregations that God looks at the heart rather than outward appearances. Even visitors from neighboring towns had heard the remarkable story. Whenever someone passed the old church where David and Grace had exchanged their vows, someone would inevitably say, "This is where the richest man in town arrived in an old Kiki." and every time the story left people smiling. On a bright Saturday morning, David and Grace drove through the town in a simple family SUV. Although David could easily have chosen one of his luxury cars, he still preferred simple things whenever possible. Sitting in the back seat were their two young children, a cheerful 4-year-old boy named Daniel and his little sister, Faith, who had just turned 2. The children laughed happily as they pointed at people walking along the roadside. Grace turned around with a smile. "Are you two behaving yourselves?" "Yes, Mommy," they answered together. David laughed. "They're definitely your children." Grace raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" "They're much better behaved than I was." The family burst into laughter. Their driver slowed the vehicle as they entered the town square. David noticed a familiar face standing beside a roadside stall. Baba Musa. The elderly man was now retired, enjoying a peaceful life after David had helped him buy a comfortable home years earlier. David immediately asked the driver to stop. He stepped out of the SUV and warmly embraced the old man. "My son," Baba Musa exclaimed happily. "You haven't changed." David laughed. "I could say the same about you." Daniel and Faith climbed out of the vehicle and greeted the elderly man politely. "Good morning, Grandpa Musa." The old man's face lit up. "Good morning, my little angels." Grace smiled as she watched them together. She knew that no amount of wealth could replace the joy of genuine relationships. As they chatted, a group of teenagers nearby recognized David. One of them whispered excitedly, "That's him, the billionaire?" "Yes, the one who came to his wedding in a kiki." The teenagers walked over respectfully. "Sir," David smiled. "Yes." One young man hesitated before speaking. "Is the story really true?" David chuckled. "Which part?" "The old kiki." David looked toward Baba Musa and smiled. "Every word." The teenagers exchanged amazed glances. "But why?" David thought for a moment before answering. "Because I wanted to know who could see beyond what my eyes could see." The young people listened carefully. David continued, "If someone only respects you because of your money, they'll stop respecting you the moment the money disappears." The teenagers nodded thoughtfully. "But if someone loves your heart," he looked at Grace with a smile, "that kind of love lasts forever." Grace reached for his hand. "It certainly does." One of the teenagers smiled. "I'll never forget that." David gently patted the young man's shoulder. "I hope you don't." Later that afternoon, the family drove to the headquarters of the Grace Johnson Foundation. The organization had grown beyond anything Grace had ever imagined. It now operated schools, vocational training centers, health clinics, and scholarship programs across several states. Thousands of families had received help through its work. As they toured one of the schools funded by the foundation, children ran toward David and Grace with joyful smiles. "Uncle David, Auntie Grace." The couple greeted every child warmly. David knelt beside a little boy who proudly held up his report card. "I came first in my class." David beamed with pride. "Well done." The little boy smiled from ear to ear. "I'm going to become an engineer one day." David nodded. "I believe you will." Grace watched the interaction with tears of happiness in her eyes. Years ago, people had pitted her for marrying a man they believed was poor. Now that same marriage had become the reason thousands of children had opportunities they never would have had otherwise. As evening approached, David and Grace returned home. After putting Daniel and Faith to bed, they walked hand in hand through their garden. The moonlight reflected beautifully on the small lake behind their house. Grace leaned gently against David. "Do you ever regret it?" He looked at her. "Regret what?" "The test." David smiled softly. "Sometimes." Grace looked surprised. "You do." "I regret seeing how quickly people judged one another." He sighed quietly. "But I don't regret discovering your heart." Grace smiled. "And I'd marry the man in the old kiki all over again." David laughed. "I was hoping you'd say that." They sat together on a wooden bench overlooking the garden. For a while, neither of them spoke. The peaceful silence was enough. Finally, Grace turned to him. "Do you know what the greatest gift you've ever given me is?" David smiled. I've given you quite a few gifts. She laughed. I'm not talking about houses or jewelry. Then what? You showed me that true wealth isn't found in a bank account. She gently rested her head on his shoulder. It's found in the kind of person you choose to become. David kissed the top of her head. And you reminded me that true love doesn't ask how much you own. It asks how much you care. They smiled at one another. Not far from the garden stood the old yellow Kiki. David had restored it carefully and placed it beneath a beautiful glass shelter. Visitors often asked why a billionaire would preserve such an ordinary vehicle. A small bronze plaque beside it held the answer. It read, "Never judge a person's value by what they drive, wear, or own. The greatest treasures are often hidden beneath the simplest appearances." This Kiki reminds us that humility reveals character, while pride blinds the heart. Every visitor who read those words paused for a moment of reflection. Some smiled. Others quietly wiped away tears. The old Kiki had become more than a vehicle. It had become a symbol of a lesson that transformed an entire town. And so, the wedding that began with laughter ended with wisdom. The poor mechanic who never existed had revealed the richest man in town. The bride everyone pitied became the woman everyone admired. The proud learned humility. The judgmental learned compassion. And a simple old Kiki became a reminder that the greatest riches in life are not measured by wealth, but by love, kindness, forgiveness, and the courage to see the value in people long before the rest of the world does. If you enjoyed this emotional story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Your support helps this channel grow and inspires me to bring you more heartwarming and emotional stories every week. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.